All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's Snack and Chat. We hope you're doing okay out there. This is Adopt for Life's weekly Facebook Live, where we explore topics that are top of mind for our families formed by adoption, kinship, and customary care. My name is Chantal, and I am part of the Adopt for Life team. For those of you that are here watching live, thank you for tuning in. Feel free to put any questions in the chat or any comments. I will take just this moment to remind you that we are live streaming on our public Facebook page. So anything that you are sharing in the comments is going to be available publicly. So we just ask that you be mindful about what information that you are sharing. So with that in mind, please go ahead and let us know that you're there and you're watching. And if you have any questions or comments to add, please feel free to do so. I will pass it over to Catherine in a moment. I'm just going to take a second to introduce our guest today, Andrea Warnick. Welcome. Andrea is a registered nurse and registered psychotherapist whose passion lies in helping individuals, families, and communities support people of all ages who are grieving an illness or death in their lives. With years of nursing and counseling experience, both in Canada and abroad, and a master's degree in thanatology, the study of dying and death, Andrea brings to her work a rare mixture of medical and psychosocial expertise. She developed and teaches the 5-day certificate program in children's grief and bereavement at Sick Kids Center for Community Mental Health. She also is the host of Kids Grief Q&A, a free monthly forum through Canadian Virtual Hospice, where she responds to questions from families and professionals about supporting grieving children and youth. Andrea lives in Guelph, Ontario, from where she runs Andrea Warnick Consulting, a group practice of 20 therapists who provide grief counseling and education across Ontario. So thank you again, Andrea, for taking time to be with us on our Snack and Chat today. It's, at times, or most of the times, a heavy topic, but we appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise with our families. So with that, I'm just gonna say, hi, Catherine. Over to you.
Thank you so much. You are a busy woman, Andrea. I think I've gotten to know you many moons ago. We were connected when I was first starting with Adopt for Life. I don't think I realized how busy you actually are. So this is fantastic. And I know a lot of the resources and the amazing work that you are doing, that's something that we're going to be sharing with the community as well in the comments. So people who are watching, don't worry, you don't need to worry about furiously trying to write it all down. We'll make sure that everybody has access. We have way more questions than we are absolutely ever going to get through in 45 minutes. So I'm going to just go ahead and start asking away if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. And for those of you who, sorry, before I say, if we haven't had the opportunity to answer your questions today, or if you're watching live or on replay and do have a question that we weren't able to get to, please feel free to know that we're going to reach out and make sure that you have ways to ask questions after this. 45 minutes just isn't going to be a said and done thing for us. And we know Andrea's contact, so I mean, okay. First question. So grief is obviously really tough and a complex topic for a lot of adoptive kin and customary families. It's a complex topic for anyone, period, I think. Mm-hmm. So can you briefly maybe talk about some of the additional layers of complexities that families who are formed by adoption, kin or customary care deal with when thinking about grief and loss?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is where I want to be really transparent and humble about the fact that my expertise lies in supporting kids when somebody's dying or somebody has died. I've worked with a lot of families where a child has been adopted. However, it's not my expertise. I don't want to pretend to know the experience of, families in general and what they're contending with. But one of the things that I have seen in a lot of the families that I've worked with in which a child has been adopted is this whole concept is disenfranchised grief, and to me, it's always an overly academic word, but it's a really important concept because it's often what we'll refer to as unacknowledged grief. right? And sometimes the griever themselves is disenfranchised. That may be the case of somebody who is a birth parent. This might be the case of a young child, right? Who we can be quick to say, oh, my 2-year-old is too young. They don't understand. I'm not going to enter the conversation or include them at the funeral and things like that. But really, I mean, disenfranchised grief is something that many adoptive families contend with, this sort of grief that exists, but is unacknowledged or, unsupported sometimes. And that can be from kids, and this can be from parents, right? But it's something that, is really beneficial to be able to recognize, to be able to identify. This may be a child who is grieving a relationship that is not a reliable one or that doesn't exist at all with a birth parent or birth parents. And sometimes, I mean, one of the things I learned early into this work with grieving kids is that, as much as parents want to protect their kids, kids also want to protect their parents. Right? It's actually easier for me to work with adults and get them to enter into more hard conversations and realize that, in fact, the best way to protect their kids is to prepare kids and actually often talk about some of the harder things to talk about. That's an easier sell than for me to work with a 6-year-old and get them to stop protecting their parents. And this is where I've certainly seen, in adoptive families where kids sometimes are experiencing grief. They might not even know to call it that, but also be hesitant to be open or to talk about it out of fear that it'll be upsetting to the adults in their lives. This is something in my work also, as a nurse before I went into doing therapy, I worked with young kids who sometimes were dying themselves, who would know it, but quickly go into protective mode of their parents and not want to bring up their impending death. No, and there's been studies on this, knowing that it might be too hard for the adults. And that's where I think one of the most important things we can do is create safe spaces where kids can talk about their grief, and we can help give them the language for grief. And one of the best ways to do this is for adults to do it themselves as well and give themselves space to grieve. I will often say that in my work, just in general, one of the biggest things I'm helping people navigate is reconciling the life that they are living with the life that they expected or thought that they would be living. And usually we've got a bunch of disenfranchised grief wrapped up in that.
And I'm totally putting you on the spot here.
Go for it.
Is there any resources? Because I remember when, just shortly before we started this live, learning about disenfranchised grief, like this can be a new term for a lot of families. It certainly was something that was newer for us to learn. Is there any resources or anything that parents can, even if they wanted to learn more about disenfranchised grief, do you know of any?
Yeah, I mean, the person who coined the term was Kenneth Doka, who's a grief therapist who does a lot of work in this area. So I haven't read them, but he probably has books and everything that acknowledge and talk about it. But there's a great New York Times article that recently came out really talking about disenfranchised grief in relation to the pandemic. And that just came out a few weeks ago. And I think has put that terminology on more people's sort of radars. And I would really encourage people to read that article as well. It's not going to be referencing children as much, if I remember correctly, but certainly refers to Kenneth Doka and his work. And Kenneth Doka would be a place to look as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I just know there's a lot. For me, it's like the wheels are spinning. I'm like, what is this? A new term?
Yeah.
So I appreciate it. And also, just to clarify before we move on, like when we talk about grief, in this, maybe specifically more in the work that you do in supporting children, is it always grief in relation to death, or could it be other forms of grief as well?
Yeah, it's a great question, Catherine. I'm so glad you asked it because I think it's something that we should clarify early on in our chat. And no, grief is not just specific to death. So whenever I'm going into schools, whenever I'm working with groups of kids and adults, I'll often do a brainstorm of all the different things that grief can encompass. And I'll usually define it as any time we have a significant, I might not say significant to a 4-year-old, but a big loss in life. Right? So any sort of significant loss, this could be moving, from one community to another, parents separating, somebody's gender transition, loss of employment, loss of income, loss of relationship with birth families, loss of, I work with kids who, their parent may be alive and physically healthy, but it's not the relationship that they would hope to have with whether it's a birth parent or an adoptive parent. And so really, I think it's so important that we help kids develop grief literacy and understand that grief is any significant loss. When we moved from Toronto to Guelph about 4 years ago now, my eldest was 6 at the time. And for a year, she was like, you know what grief does to children. Why would you do this to us? And so really categorizing herself as a grieving child, right? Which, might be really sort of playing with it a bit. And this is where, I also think it's important that we help kids understand, like, when I talk to kids about grief, I will often say it's the thoughts and feelings that we have when experiencing a big loss in life, because some kids and some adults are wired way more to being emotive and expressing either verbally or through tears. And I work with so many kids who sometimes will be like, everyone else in my family is crying or looking really upset, and I'm not expressing myself the same way. Does this mean I don't care? Does this mean that I didn't love my grandpa? And questions like that. And that's where I really like to help, not just kids, all parents as well, understand that we all experience grief in really different ways. And for some people, it's going to be a much more cerebral, thought-based process. And to be honest, sometimes people are at a disadvantage in that. Like when we look at our support groups and grief counseling and things like that, like that's really going to be tailored and privileging people who are more comfortable going and talking about their feelings and their experiences with other people, and people who are more cerebral might struggle with that. It's why, pre-pandemic, I always had a puzzle in my office. So if I'm working with teenagers who are not going to want to look me in the eyes and talk about what they're feeling and things like that, we could be working on a puzzle together, and be talking about things which might create a safer space for them to do so.
That makes sense. And I know, like, even from my personal experience in my children, like I have one child who manifests loss and grief through tummy aches. And so I know, because I get to know my children, and, and their child is more behavioral. And so for me, it took a long while to kind of make that connection, but I think it's a great valid point that you're making, is understanding how that grief kind of comes out.
Yeah. So and I think I'm glad you said that as well, because I'd say for a lot of kids, they're not going to verbally express it. Yeah. It's going to be very somatic for a lot of kids, even the more cerebral thing, right? So it's going to be like, exactly as you said, tummy aches, headaches. I need to sleep in the bed with you all the time. I'm waking up in the night. I need more affection, for the kids who want affection in the first place. For the kids who don't, they might need more space. So it's usually, I try not to use the language of acting out. I like the language more of big behaviors. But most of our, well-funded, I should say, children's grief centers, like the Lighthouse program, the Season Center in Barrie, they've got volcano rooms. They've got rooms for kids to throw themselves against the wall that are padded, and punching bags and things like that, to make space for big behaviors, because, there are big feelings that come a part of grief.
Absolutely. I do want to apologize. I'm noticing that my internet's a bit spotty. Please let me know if you guys can hear me okay on the live. And Chantel, if I do drop off for whatever reason, I might need you to check it. It always does it. Everyone's online right now. We haven't even gotten to question 2. Okay, this is what happens. Let's start. Okay, so this is a question from our community. So we have an adopted child with openness, and a birth family member often messages the child from the hospital, commenting things like, this is the end, I love you. And this is something that's happened a few times, resulting in increased anxiety for the child. Do you have any advice on how to best manage this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complex question, so I don't know that I'm going to really do it justice. But, a few of the considerations that I would have, I mean, first, depending on the age of the child, right? With a younger child, I'd actually probably create a bit of a barrier there, and maybe even have a boundary. And not to say that necessarily the person in the hospital is going to respect that, but letting them know, like, this is, especially if it sounds like this was not a one-off. And so if it's happening, a number of times, saying like, this is having a detrimental effect on our child. It's really upsetting for them, and certainly we want to encourage, openness if we do think you're dying, because that's ultimately what it sounds like the person is sometimes experiencing. And we want to do this in a way that we can best support our child as well. And so this might be that if you are really worried that this is it and this is the end, and again, this is going to depend on the context of the family and the relationships and everything else, but that you reach out to us as the parent, as the adults, who can then decide when and how to communicate this with our child. And that's where I would just, now this is different. If you've got a teenager, who's directly doing the communication and stuff, it is more difficult to create those sort of boundaries and things like that. But I would want the teen on board. I would want to be having a discussion with the teen in that situation as well, saying, this is one of the things I'm toying with, is reaching out to your birth parent and just asking that, that type of communication comes to us first, and we will absolutely come to you with that quickly, if that's what you want, and you'd really want to respect the teen's guidance in that. But that's where we do want to give the teen some autonomy. And so I think the thing that it does sound like is already happening, which I think is a good thing, is that child is then talking to their parents about what's happening, right? And that's what I would want. So for the communication that we can't control, I'm always encouraging kids, if anybody says something that's upsetting or scary or confusing for you, please come to me so we can talk about it together, and I can help you understand, and we can help get an idea. So would be some of the considerations I would take into place.
Perfect, thank you. And I realize some of the questions we're coming are, again, pretty specific, so I apologize. And we don't have all the details, so this is just information that we kind of received as well. And so obviously, if someone wanted more support, they can be connecting with you or your team as well.
Absolutely.
Openness in general is challenging. It's not a linear thing. So I think, as with any aspect with open relationships with birth family members, sometimes having those tough conversations are important as well.
Yeah.
Regardless of what it's about.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. I recently found out that my child's birth family member passed away. I don't even know how to bring this up with them. And I'm assuming that's with the children. Where do I even start?
Yeah, and this is where I would encourage, backed on what you were saying, Catherine, about openness, is you want to come. I usually would start by having, if there's siblings, I usually like to have the siblings in the room. If it's the birth parent of just one of your children, you might just individually be having that child, or the birth family member. You might just have that child in the conversation. And usually I encourage families to start by saying, listen, this is a difficult conversation. But in our family, if this is true, but in our family, when hard stuff happens, we are honest about it. So sort of setting those parameters really reinforces for kids a level of trust, right? And it might be, I might cry as I'm having this conversation. I like to give kids a heads up about that and let them know, and it's okay. And any feelings that you have are okay too. And then you want to use, what I'm always encouraging families is, don't use euphemisms. You don't want to say passed away or we lost your birth uncle or anything like that. It's, so-and-so died yesterday or last week or last month. This is hard for us to tell you, but we want you to know about it. And we want you to know that you can ask us any questions. And I find sometimes in supporting kids, we're hesitant to open that up. You can ask any questions because we're worried they're going to nail us with things that we can't answer. And I used to always sort of feel like I was failing kids in some way when I couldn't answer their questions. And I've really come to think of it in a very different way, that if this child feels safe enough to ask big, hard questions that I can't answer, I've probably done a really good job creating safety for them. And I'd much rather that child is asking me the question I can't answer, as opposed to wondering by themselves, and that's where I'm really clear. I might not know, but I might be able to get that information for you. Do you want me to seek out that information and come back with it? And sometimes, I had one child who was like, after the death of her mom, she was like, the one thing my dad can't answer is, does everything happen for a reason, or are some things really random? And I was just like, whoa, like, that's a big one. And what I let her know is it wasn't that her dad was holding out on her and not trusting her with that information. He doesn't know. There's some times where we can't get to the answer. We don't know the answer. And that's where I'd still rather us do that wondering together, even about life's mysteries.
And can I ask as well, so like thinking about the ages of different children, like at what point is it the age or maybe the developmental stage? Like at what point do you share like specific information? Because sometimes we lose family members in very traumatic ways. And I know there's been times in the families that we support that they're worried to tell their family or to tell their children it was because of an overdose or a suicide or murder and things like that. So do you have like a type of rule of thumb for that?
I'd say my rule of thumb is that, like, we always want to be honest, and my guiding principle is that we don't want to give the child more information than they want, yet we're going to take their lead in how much information. And that doesn't tend to be typically age related. I mean, I've worked with a lot of 3-year-olds who have had someone die through substance use, through suicide. Usually what we're going to do is we're going to start by telling them that their person died. Most, even 3-year-olds, are going to ask you how at some point. What happened? How did it happen? Right? When I'm talking about suicide, I might say, they caused their body to die. I'm not necessarily I'm not going to give the hows unless this individual child is asking for that information. Right? For substance use, there's actually a great resource on the Dr. J Children's Grief Center website. And it talks about, now it's specific to when somebody has died from substance use, but even for a lot of the families who might just be navigating a substance use disorder in a birth family or in an adoptive family, there's great language. It was developed by families and clinicians, but many families who had somebody die with a substance use disorder who have young kids. And so they use a lot of language there and guidance on how to talk about this. But that's where, for me, there's generally never a too early. So a 2, 3, 4-year-old, I mean, they're not going to understand the word suicide any more than cancer. But if we help them understand and explain, even with cancer, I'd be saying it is different than COVID-19, which gets spread really quickly from one person to another. You can hug your grandma with cancer. You're not going to get cancer from her. That child will grow into an understanding much faster. And certainly with suicide, substance use disorder, the literature and the research is really the same. We want to be honest with kids. We don't want to initially say, well, it was a heart attack, and then 6 years down the line, be changing that story. Yeah. Right? So we're just going to use simple language. We're not going to dump too much information on them. The resource, which is also free, kidsgrief.ca, walks parents right through some of those conversations, whether it's a suicide, whether it's a medically assisted death, which we're seeing more and more in Canada as well, which can be hard for parents to know how to navigate.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And all of the resources that you talked about, I believe Chantel is posting on the comments as well. So feel free, if you're not in a smile, so feel free to check them out as well. Okay, I lost my train of thought. I have so many questions for you. Where are we? Okay, here we go. Now, we're on 5. Okay, we'll get there. We recently became kin parents to our children after the loss of their birth family less than a year ago. As a result, my children are very anxious and hypervigilant anytime I leave the house. Do you have any suggestions on how to help calm their fears?
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly think one of the biggest fears of most children is abandonment, of this idea of being left to, navigate things on their own and take care of themselves. And this is something that I see in so many of the kids I work with, even kids who might have one surviving healthy parent. If a parent has died, they often have this worry. And this is where one of the things I really encourage families to do is first name it, right? Daniel Siegel, the psychiatrist who wrote The Whole Brain Child, talks about name it to tame it all the time. this is very applicable in grief work. So I'd really be wanting to work with the kids and wonder about their biggest worries, right? I often like to write a list, like, what are your worries? This child is probably worried that their caregivers are going to die, or not be able to take care of them in some way. And so I'd want to sort of write that down, get it on paper. Whenever possible, I like doing socially constructed genograms with kids because they're so much more inclusive, right? So you've got the kid in the middle, but you have these concentric circles that go out, and you have the kid name the important people in their lives. I always include people who have died as well, and I have them on there, and then I'll do things like, I will find out from families, okay, if something were to happen to you and you weren't able to continue to raise these kids, who would be their guardians, right? And then let's star on this socially constructed genogram, or just have a conversation with the kids about it. But I always want kids to know that there is a backup plan. That backup plan might be foster care, it might be other kin, but they should know the backup plan. And even when it's a hard conversation, I can think of a few families where the conversation really was like there weren't any kin. The backup plan was going to be foster care. Their anxiety coming down because what they were actually imagining was being left on the streets trying to fend for themselves, right? Oldest kids taking care of young kids and everything else. And that's where, when we don't fill in the blanks for kids and let them know what a plan is, they are going to imagine it even worse. So I would really encourage this family, A, name it to tame it. But B, be able to let them know that there is a backup plan. And the way I'll often, encourage adults to talk about it is, we'll probably never need this plan, right? If you're healthy, or there's two of you, or whatever the situation is, let them know. Let them know, most likely, and we can usually say this in Canada, most likely, by the time we can't take care of you, you'll be old enough to take care of yourself. You might be taking care of us at this point, right? But if that weren't to happen, then this is the backup plan. And this is where, if the kids are still really worried and really, stressed about sort of separation anxiety and things like that, you may want to get a counselor involved who can help them with that, because it might be they've got a whole fight or flight going on where they're really going into panic mode around it. And we don't want to leave kids with that for a long period of time.
Absolutely. And I can't imagine the extra added layer if, since this is a kin family, the parents themselves have grief of loss as well. So that whole dynamic, I can't imagine what that's probably like right now. So glad they were able to ask the question in retail. Those are fantastic tips.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is an interesting, what is in your opinion, what is an appropriate age? What is an appropriate age to attend a funeral?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'll give my opinion, and everyone gets to do what you want with it, with your kids. I say there's never too young to attend a funeral. Throughout most of history, death was in the home, right? Like, siblings were dying in bed with their other siblings. We were washing grandma's body in the front parlor. We are really in a kind of unique, somewhat strange time in history where we've outsourced death. We let kids see all kinds of death on the media, but we're really hesitant around sort of more natural death that happens. 90% of the population dies from diseases, illnesses, not sudden deaths, ones where we kind of know it's coming, right? And yet what we see in the media tends to be the more sudden, violent deaths. And this is where, even when I'm working with young kids, so our 1-year-old, 2-year-olds, sure, they might not remember if they were at a funeral, but it's a part of their story. There will be a day where they will ask, was I there? Where was I that day? And that's where I really encourage everybody who has not included their kids at funerals and stuff. This does not mean that you've derailed them, you've derailed their grief process, or you've totally messed them up, or anything else. But I encourage as much as possible, just including kids, have them there. I work with so many families who are having to prepare funerals, which is extra challenging over the last year, I would say. But I really encourage, when we've got young kids who are going to be there, if I'm going to my dad's funeral, I'm not going to want to have to leave if my 3-year-old is dysregulated or having a hard time. So as much as possible, I encourage families, particularly with young kids, but even sometimes older, Like have a buddy system, have a relative or somebody who's not super close. It could be a babysitter, not super close to the person who died, who can buddy up with the kids. I like to do things with kids where I'm like, okay, if you feel like you've had enough and you need to leave, you can give me a signal, come up with a signal, tug your ear, whatever. I let the kid come up with it. And that means you need a break. And that's where we just sort of want to plan to really, have people in place if they need to leave with the kids. But I find, I often, to be honest, guys, I often encourage people, I'm like, again, not so much in COVID, but, when the elderly lady down the street dies, like, bring your kid to that funeral as a way to like teach them about our rituals and traditions around death and things like that. So there's never a too young for me, but we do want to prepare them, and there was a seminal study, the Harvard Child Bereavement Study, that really looked at kids going to their parents' funeral, and the vast majority of kids benefited from being a part of it.
And when you speak of the plan, like, do you mean like it kind of explain what's going to happen? So this is if it's open or closed casket, or like kind of what do you expect? It might be around this long. You're going to see people crying or sharing stories, like that type of planning, you mean?
Yeah, all of those things. So I totally, and I apologize, I have a really obnoxious cat. I'm gonna.
Oh, I thought it was mine.
No, totally mine.
I'm
going to just put that cat out there, okay? I thought I locked everybody out, but evidently not the cat.
I honestly thought it was mine. So.
No, this is where it's exactly what you said, Catherine. Like I prepare kids, like if I know that there's going to be a body there, I'm going to prepare them for that. I'm going to say, listen, you can touch your dad, like he might feel colder than you're used to. He might have makeup on. I had an 8-year-old once tell the funeral director to redo that makeup job because like she was not happy with that, and I love that she did that. I'm going to, exactly as you said too, I want to prepare them for the emotions that they're going to see in other people as well. You might see people laughing. You might see people crying. Kids do a phenomenal job of balancing like deep joy and deep sorrow at the same time in the way that adults struggle with more. And that's where I always like to say kids too, listen, if you're running around having fun with cousins at the funeral and somebody says something to you, like you shouldn't be laughing or you shouldn't be having fun, please come back and talk to me about that. Because one of the things I know about grief is we can be laughing and having fun, and it doesn't mean we're not grieving. It doesn't mean we don't care about this person. We can do both of those things at the same time. And in fact, kids are much better at it than adults are.
Absolutely. I'm just going to pick questions at random here.
You go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Like 10 minutes left. So this is actually a good little segue. So we talked about managing emotions. So the question is, my child has had no reaction at all to the passing of their biological father, and they never talk about it. Do I keep bringing it up? Do I discuss it or just leave it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's where I would encourage the parent to keep taking the lead and bringing it up every now and then, just inviting the child, saying, listen, if at any point you do want to talk about this, but it might also be not putting so much onus on the child, but just weaving the biological father into conversation sometimes. But, the other thing is, there's a few things I'd be curious. One is just because we're not seeing signs of grief the way we would expect to, doesn't mean the child's not grieving, So it could be a protective thing. It could be like a child is doing it in their bed at night when nobody else is around. It could be that this child is a very cerebral griever and it's not going to be evident to people, but they're very deeply thinking about it, The other piece is we don't want to assume because right now the child's not really talking about it or expressing that will always be the case, because kids grieve in chunks. And this is in the immediacy. You might have a child who finds out that their biological father died and who is like really sad for 6 minutes and then runs off to play video games. And that is completely natural. But this is also that a 6-year-old is going to grieve and think about a loss really different when they're 12, when they're 18, when they're 34. We revisit these things at different times in our life. So I encourage that parent to keep taking the lead inviting the child, if they want to talk about it, but just, weaving, like, I in general want to instill in my kids that, when people die in our life, they're still a part of our life. There's, and we talk about them. You might want to ask the kids, do you want to have a picture frame with his picture in it, right? Or do you not, right? And that's okay as well. But really fostering that death doesn't end a relationship, and that inviting piece, because it might be, how the kid does this months or years down the line is very different.
So I guess in that same thought, then, it isn't necessarily protecting children by not bringing it up yourself. So I know there's sometimes people have thought, okay, well, I don't want to talk about so-and-so because I don't want to upset them. So that actually could actually have the reverse of what you're hoping to do.
Absolutely. And this is where I encourage adults to take the lead, and even in people that the kids haven't met. Like, it might be my grandparent, or my dad actually died before my youngest kid was alive, right? And we've really made sure, though, that she knows her grandpa, right? Like, we tell stories about him. We talk about what he would do if he was alive and able to interact with her and things like that. I worked in Botswana for a bit, and people knew their ancestors' stories back so many generations, right? And I think that tradition of storytelling and really fostering ongoing connection with people who are not physically in our life, albeit because maybe it's because they've died, and maybe it's because they're not able to be present, is really protective for kids. And that's where, again, we don't want to force it on kids. If kids are like, no, it's upsetting to me when you do this, like, then we'll take the kids' lead for now, but we're going to revisit that down the road again.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more. We're good. Okay, so my child blames me for the death of their birth parent and shares feelings that if the birth parent was still alive, they would be living with them, and that they could have prevented this birth parent's death. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, I mean, that is a complicated situation. It's not, what's not uncommon about this situation is a lot of kids, and adults for that matter, like, in their grief process, a lot of anger can be there. I spent an entire session with a kid yesterday just validating it's okay to be angry, right? Like, grief is not pathology. It is a healthy human response to a really difficult situation, to a loss. Right? And it might be the loss of what was or what never had the chance to be. And this is where, in this situation, I'd be curious as to the child's narrative, as to why the child thinks that the birth parent is responsible. It is not, or sorry, that the adoptive parent is responsible. It's not uncommon for kids, like, if they don't have an answer or an explanation as to why somebody died, to just fill in the pieces themselves. Sometimes it's that somebody else is responsible. And quite often I find, and it's a hard thing to navigate for families, but that for kids, when they're angry in their grief, it usually comes out directed at the people they're closest to. So there could be an element of that, what's happening. But it's also not uncommon for kids to feel responsible themselves sometimes. I mean, one day I will write a book about all the things kids have told me, how they were responsible in some way for their person not being involved in their life, or their person having died. And that's where I'd be really curious and want to get sort of the child's narrative, as to, what their story is. What's the story they're telling themselves about this? It may be that there's some informational gaps there, and that by filling those informational gaps in and explaining actually what had happened, that shifts the narrative. It may be that this child needs a safe place. And unfortunately, right now, it's an adoptive parent, but to have the anger come out, and this is where I spend a lot of time with kids, teaching them that, listen, your feelings are absolutely okay, right? The feelings of rage, the feelings of anger, the feelings of this being unfair, the behavior, kicking your parents or whatever it is, right? If anybody's getting hurt or they're hurting themselves, it's the behavior we need to shift. So, and really, even with young kids, I mean, it's as applicable for teenagers, though, weeding those differences out, validating the behavior, the feelings, and helping shift the behaviors, letting them know if there's a consequence, or however this family deals with behaviors, that it's not about the feeling that's underlying that behavior. They have every right to that feeling. And that's where I think a little bit of that psychoeducation about grief too, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages model, I think did a lot of wonderful things, but this 5 stages model did a real disservice to people in terms of their concept of grief. It's not a linear process. It's a mess, right? Sometimes there's periods of grace when you least expect them to be, and sometimes there's what I call grief bursts when you least expect them to be there. And that's where I think part of it is making room for some messiness. And I think one of the things that can be most important in supporting a child, even among the small losses, your child loses the balloon in the Canadian Tire parking lot or whatever it is just not rushing in and trying to, distract or dissuade the child from their pain, right? Being able to help build up the child's confidence that you can feel this sad, it can be this hard, you can be this mad, and you can survive it. And I think it's a real thing for us as adults to try to model. And I mean, I'm constantly learning it myself as well. But to really, do that reframe that, the best protection for kids is not withholding, not having the conversations or not including them, but including them, preparing them, and helping build up their confidence that as humans, we're designed to be able to experience really intense feelings, a lot of suffering, and be able to survive that.
Thank you so much. I tried to get through as many as I could, but you just have so many good things to say. I just go off on my tangent, so I appreciate it. Before we wrap up, are you able to share more? So if people want to get a hold of you or your employees, or what's the best way for people to get in contact if they're looking for some support around this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you just Google Andrea Warnick Consulting, it's basically, that's the website, Andrea Warnick Consulting. And so, and we're a team of like 20 therapists sort of spread like right across Ontario, but pretty much everything's online right now anyway. And so that's one option. I mean, we are all private therapists. So unfortunately, it's either, fee for service. A lot of times benefits will cover many of us. But the other thing is Canadian Virtual Hospice, like we do once a month, we do a Q&A where it's literally me sitting there and anybody can come and ask questions. And so I'll make sure you guys have that link as well to send out to people. So any of these questions that we didn't get to, I mean, these are exactly the type of questions that families and professionals, it's usually half families, half professionals, bring to the Q&A. And it's once a month. If you can't come live, you just email the question in before, as people did today. I'll answer it and we send you out the recording afterwards as well. So it's good to know that there's not enough free services, but there are some services where there's no barriers to access.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm on time, Chantal. I'm so proud of myself. And this is a tough subject, but it's needed. And I just really appreciate your willingness to just kind of jump in and answer these questions, because this is a reality. This is everyone's reality, right? So we really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. No, it's so great to be here. And I think, everything that we discussed today too, I encourage people just in terms of the pandemic, opening up the conversation about all the losses. They may seem small, not being on the hockey team, not being in choir, not being able to see your friends in person and hug them and touch them, but it's significant. Like that's disenfranchised grief too. Right? So being able to help kids name that and even do it for ourselves as adults and make space for the feelings around it is going to go a long way to everyone's recovery as well.
Absolutely.
I guess you'll just have to come back and talk about that.
Yes, I can keep going for hours when you get me on grief, guys. So.
Well, thanks again, Andrea. It was just amazing to have you on today. We really, really appreciate it. So thanks again. And we will have to have you back again.
I look forward to it. Thank you guys so much for finding me and having me in the first place.
All right, everyone, that brings us to the end of this week's Snack and Chat. Next week, well, the tables are turned and Catherine and I will be answering questions. Tracy Morsen is going to come on as our guest host to dole out those questions. So you'll want to tune in and see what happens live. You never know. Have a great Tuesday, everyone, and a great week, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.